Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here, and great to have the opportunity to talk about our excavations at Tirnony Portal Tomb, which, as Brona has already said, was a joint project carried out between the then Northern Ireland Environment Agency, now Historic Environment Division of DFC, and what was then the Centre for Archaeological Fieldwork at Queen's. And it's especially sort of appropriate because we're just about to go to publication. This has been accepted for publication and is currently in press with the Royal Irish Academy, proceedings of the Royal Irish Academy. So we should see it in hard copy and online within the next few months. And you should be all able to read it soon enough. They do, for a little while, embargo these papers, but you'll be able to read it soon enough online on the Royal Irish Academy website, and I'll be putting it up onto my own webpage on ResearchGate and Academia if anybody wants to look it up there before it officially goes live for everyone to read through the Royal Irish Academy portal. So I want to do a little bit first of all and set the scene with regards to the excavation. The tomb at Tirnony is a Neolithic portal tomb, and archaeologists, they fire a lot of phrases about like Neolithic and megalithic. We fire them out as if we know what we're talking about, and we sometimes don't realise that while people are familiar with those phrases, not everyone necessarily has a full contextual background, if you like, about what we're talking about. And so at the risk of slightly boring maybe some of the archaeologists, I want to, just before talking about the excavation itself in more detail, talk a little bit about what society was like at the time that this tomb was constructed. And the first thing is this tomb was constructed during the Neolithic period. And Neolithic is a term which means new Stone Age, Neolithos. And it's generally associated with the first farming communities in the world. Farming, which may have been invented a couple of times, it was definitely invented a couple of times separately in different regions around the world. But for our purposes, in Europe and in certainly Western Asia, the technology of farming spread out to the Fertile Crescent, probably starting around about 10 or 11,000 BC. I think there are some reasons now, maybe to just push it maybe even a little further back, and then gradually making its way through the Levant into southeastern Europe, and then gradually up through the European landmass, eventually reaching Ireland and Britain more or less about the same time, around about 4000 BC. This is a step change, if you like, in society in Western Europe and in these islands at that time. Because up until that point, up until these new Neolithic settlers bringing new Neolithic technology moved across the continent and finally made their way into our part of the world, we had a very different sort of society which was based around purely hunting and gathering, a society which was based very much on the yearly cycle of the growth of different plants and animal foodstuffs, the runs of salmon in the river, the eels, the appearance of different natural resources in the environment. And it changed to a society which was much more of a society in which people were in control of their own subsistence, at least to an extent, where they were able to produce their own foodstuffs and where they altered their own environments. And just to illustrate this is a pollen diagram. One of the things which archaeologists use or paleoenvironmentalists with archaeologists use to build up a background picture of the society. And is this one of these digital pointers? Or am I not going to press something that's go wrong? Is it? No, it's not. No, is that one? No, I'll just point there. You can probably see here at a certain point in time there is a big increase in the number of plants that are associated with an open landscape, and a big decrease in the number of plants which are associated with forests, such as trees. And this happens in Ireland, starts to happen around about 4000 BC and becomes very significant around about 3800 BC. And that's one of the first indicators of farming communities. These early farming communities, this is an excellent reconstruction of an early Neolithic farmstead by Philip Armstrong. These early Neolithic communities typically clustered in small villages of a few rectangular houses, and they would have cleared a certain amount of land, cleared a certain amount of fields in the primordial forest, which existed before then, and they subsisted mostly on a few crops. They had wheat, and they had barley. They probably didn't have oats until significantly later. And there's a certain amount of debate as to whether they may have had leguminous crops like peas. Evidence has not yet been found in Ireland for those, but they're found in Neolithic communities in continental Europe, so it's reasonable to suppose they may have brought them with them to Ireland and Britain. And they also had a small number of livestock. They had sheep, and they had cows also. And in addition to bringing this new step change technology, they also had of farming. They also had a number of other very interesting and new technologies. The most notable of which is ceramic technology. This is a Neolithic pottery vessel from County Antrim, dates to about 3600 BC, and this is what's called carinated bowl pottery because of the carination at the sort of bend, if you like, shoulder on the side of the vessel. And this is not just a new technology, but it's also in some respects cognitively a new way of looking at things, because it's transformative of the world. And the way that farming is transformative of the landscape, this is another thing which is transformative of clay through moulding and then the medium of fire. And also, there were more sophisticated stoneworking techniques, such as, the flint tools are being used before the New Stone Age, before 4000 BC in Ireland and Britain. But with the New Stone Age came these new, much more sophisticated stone working techniques. And this is actually a blade from the Tirnony portal tomb, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And you can see the beautiful removal of tiny little flakes to create this wonderful faceted surface, which it's more beautiful in real life than it actually is even in photographs. And although things like polished stone axes were not entirely new in the Neolithic period, there were polished axes made before that. They become much more common, and they're made much more on an industrial scale as you start to move into this period. But perhaps the biggest change in the Neolithic period is not necessarily the technology. The biggest change is probably in people's mindsets. Because before the advent of farming technology, people were very much focused on an annual progression of the year. Things appeared on the trees. Eels and salmon ran up the rivers. Consistently, year after year, you would see the same animals in the same sort of habitats at the same times of the years. You could depend on it, and people were reacting to the environment in which they were found largely, rather than creating the environment in which they're found. With the advent of farming, people begin to create the environment in which they live. They start to cut down trees, they start to make fields, and they put an investment of time and effort into the building of these new farmsteads. Time and effort which is more than just simply the effort of 1 year. It's more than just simply one calendrical cycle. It's something which you have to do, and you have to maintain over a number of years, over maybe many years, to actually get the investment out of the ground that you're putting into it, to get to reap what you sow, quite literally. And this changes people's mindsets away to a more long-term mindset, and it also changes people's mindsets away from one of where the earth is bountiful into one in which your investment repays. And if you've put investment into the ground, into the earth, by creating fields and growing crops and watching the fertility over years and maybe even decades, you want to be in a position to potentially pass that on to your descendants. So it would be wrong to say this is modern concepts of ownership. It's more, probably from our ethnographic analogies, it's more like concepts of custodianship, but the idea that you and your descendants will be the long-term custodians of the land is probably something which is emerging in this period. And this may be if you like, the ideological or the cognitive backdrop to the first tombs. Tombs, more than anything else, are big stone structures. The term megalith, like giant stone structures. They are more than anything are indications of permanence. They're indications of a sense of place. They're indications of that old statement, you know, what we have, we hold. Well, what better way of doing it than building a great big stone tomb? And there seems to be some sort of connection between emergent farming societies and what archaeologists and anthropologists call monumentality. They start to build big monuments, and it's probably, we think, connected with this cognitive change that comes from putting a long-term investment into reconfiguring the landscape rather than simply living within the landscape and reacting to changes in the landscape. That's all very simplistic. I mean, at the end of the day, hunter-gatherer societies actually do, in many small ways, change their environment. And there's evidence for hunter-gatherer societies, say, encouraging, say, different types of species growth by a little bit of slash and burn at the edges of forests. You get soft fruit and things like that to come forward. But it's very minimal compared to what we see with the change to a true farming society. So again, I'm going to now talk about the 2 or 3 different types of tombs which you tend to get in the Irish landscape. And these names are again sort of fired about a lot by archaeologists, but it's easy even for archaeologists sometimes to get confused between the nuance of the different types, and for the non-specialist, it can be quite difficult to sometimes, without reading your way in quite a lot, to understand the distinction between the different tomb types. This is just a very, very quick overview of the 3 plus 1. I'm not even going to mention the 4th one, but I'll maybe mention just in passing. The 3 main tomb types that you tend to get in Irish prehistory. And the earliest one seems to be the portal tombs. This is the earliest. This is from radiocarbon analysis of both human remains and other organic materials within tombs. The earliest seems to be the portal tomb. And portal tombs are emerging about 3800 BC. With a lot of these radiocarbon dates, there's always a bit of a wobble. Radiocarbon is an accurate method of estimating age. It's sometimes said not to be accurate. It isn't an accurate method, but there is a plus or minus in the precision, if you understand the difference what I'm saying between accuracy and precision. So you could probably add plus or minus 100 years to most of the dates that I'm going to talk about today. But portal tombs appear, it seems, around about 3800 BC. It might be as early as 3900 BC from some of the radiocarbon dates, both from Tirnony and the site at Pool-na-Brone. But it's in that ballpark, and it's certainly earlier than the other tomb types. And portal tombs are really, their name comes from the Latin word porta, meaning a doorway. And you can sort of see, so moving away from the microphone, there are 2 large front door stones which form the porta, the doorway, and then a capstone which frames it. And they all have that. All portal tombs have that. They tend to be quite small. They have a single chamber. And we believe that most of them, maybe, I think probably all of them, but there's a certain amount of debate about this, are encapsulated within a cairn. A cairn is an archaeological word for basically a mound of earth and stones, probably more stones rather than earth, but maybe just capped in a little bit of earth, but a mound of stones around them. And we believe this because traces of cairns have been found around some portal tombs, and also because we think it's the most likely way that they were constructed. And I'll talk about that later on, the cairn effectively providing the ramp for the capstone to be pulled up on. However, because of the locations of many portal tombs, which tends to be not as isolated in the landscape as some other tomb types, they seem to be prey to having stone removed from them. And certainly with Tirnony portal tomb, there are reports from the Ordnance Survey memoirs, the field sheets, of stone from the cairn having been removed within the previous sort of number of decades to make roads in the vicinity. The second type of court tomb, which is very common in the Irish landscape, and particularly along with portal tombs in the northern half of the island, is the court tomb, and it's a larger tomb. It's got they're larger, and the cairns typically are more likely to survive. Most cairns have survived with court tombs. The most notable feature of them is the courtyard area, which you can see in the very well in the top left illustration there, the courtyard area at the front of a short passage, which is typically 2 or 3 chambers leading down into the centre of the cairn. The cairns are usually much bigger than the actual passage or the court itself. And the picture in the top right is actually one place called Tammany Rankin, just north of Swatra, which if you want to go and visit a court tomb, it's in state care by HED, and it's got a lovely car park. And especially if you go in January, when the wind and the undergrowth is a little bit lower, you really get a good idea of what a court tomb looks like, with a lovely courtyard framed in stone, and then the long cairn running behind it. The court tombs, there was a very large radiocarbon dating program led by Rick Schulting, formerly of Queen's, now of Oxford, a number of years ago in court tombs, and it pretty much tied down the date of the emergence of court tombs to around about 3700 BC, pretty tightly. And the third type of tomb that you typically get, certainly in the Irish Neolithic, is the famous passage tombs. Of course, you all know Newgrange and places like the Mound of the Hostages at Tara. And these are tombs which are typified by their long entrance passages. They don't have any elaboration really at the front. They don't have a prominent doorway. They don't have a courtyard. But what they do have is a long passage. And many of them, of course, have solar associations. The debate of the dates of passage tombs, well, I say there, I've actually said it twice. The earliest passage tombs probably date to around about 3600 BC in the west of Ireland. But they're a very simple form of passage tomb, very small and simple. The big ones that we all think about when we think about the passage tombs are somewhat later. They'd be sort of 3300 BC, heading towards 3000 BC or even 2900 BC for some of them. So that's the three main tomb types, and that's the type of society within which the portal tomb at Tirnony was constructed. So I've already actually slightly covered bits of this already, the main parts of the portal tomb. And this is a photograph of Tirnony before its unfortunate collapse, which we'll talk about in a minute or two. But you can see the two portal stones at the front. I've sort of got little blue lines running through them, here and here. The capstone, the large capstone, sort of prominent capstone. And prominent capstones are sort of ubiquitous, and they typically are a slightly jaunted angle, and almost look like some sort of a big quiff of hair on top of the portal tomb. Some of them are absolutely enormous, by the way. The one at Tirnony is by no means big. We weighed it on the HED or then NIEA crane from the Maghera men. And I think the measure, the weigh bridge thing on the crane measured it at 6 tons. But it's by no means the largest. In fact, it's a relatively modest one. And then behind the portal stones and underneath the capstone, there was the main chamber, which is these stones here. In Tirnony, the capstone, you can sort of see it highlighted there or outlined just so you can so it's transparent, only really covers the front of the tomb. And it is suspected that there was a secondary capstone, as sometimes occurs, sort of lower and sort of sloping downwards. And in fact, locals informed us that there had been a large stone taken from the roof of the tomb and incorporated into as a large lintel in a nearby barn associated with a farmhouse, which incidentally people said no horse would cross under without whinnying. Which was the story in the locality. The reason why we excavated at Tirnony, because this was actually one of very, very few excavations in modern times in megalithic tombs. I think previous to this, the last substantial excavation in Northern Ireland of a megalithic tomb had been in the late 70s, published in the early 80s by Dr. Brian Williams, who was formerly a senior inspector here in HED. And so this was there had been some very small investigations at megalithic tombs subsequently, but in Northern Ireland anyway, this is the first big excavation to have been done. So we tend not to do them because, of course, this is a precious resource. And these monuments have been very well cared for over the years, I have to say, by HED, ensuring the safety and security of them, taking many of them into state care, others being scheduled. And with that level of protection and control has kept most of them in very good condition. But there was something completely unforeseen happened in 2010, 2011, the very, very bad winter. This lovely ash tree, which you see, and which framed many a local sort of like sort of picnic and photograph of a picnic during the decades of the mid and late 20th century, had unfortunately sent a little roof tendril out from the tree towards this portal stone and had cracked it. And then, in the very, very bad winter of 2010, 2011, the expansion and contraction, I don't know if you remember that winter. Do you remember there was snow in the Glensian Pass until well into May. The expansion and contraction from the very, very cold weather caused the portal stone to crack, and the whole tomb essentially to collapse. And it was realised by NIEA staff who were planning the restoration of the tomb that it was very likely that the deposits inside the tomb were going to be impacted very significantly by this. So a decision was taken to carry out an excavation that was both an opportunity to get a look at a megalithic tomb, and the deposits were going to be very disturbed anyway. So it was a way of getting some, if you like, information for free without damaging more than was going to happen anyway, a very important monument. And the way that we dig, when we approach any excavation, but even more so an excavation on a very important site like this, of which we have a very limited number, we have to try and extract as much information as possible. And the way that archaeologists do that is by digging stratigraphically. Stratigraphically means in layers. So we dug in layers from the very top, in sequence right down through the monument, recording as we went along each soil layer, each deposit of stones, each feature cut into the subsoil, until we had effectively, if you like, a 3D model of the site entirely built up. We also sampled very heavily the soils which we got within the tomb. And we did this both by the soil layer, and you can sort of see the various different soil layers represented here. Can't we make them out now? But I think that's 401. I think that's 403, 4112. We had various different numbers for each of the different soil layers, descriptions for each of the different soil layers. We would take soil samples both by soil layer and also by 25 centimetre grid. We had the tomb internally split up into 25 centimetre grid squares. We brought almost every single cubic centimetre of earth back to the archaeology laboratory at Queen's, and there they were both they were both sieved. There was both flotation and wet sieving carried out of all of the materials to get as much artifactual and environmental and other information, targets for dating from the various different soil samples. So let's just briefly talk about what we found on the outside of the tomb. On the outside of the tomb, we found very little trace. In fact, we probably found no trace of the cairn, which is a little bit of a disappointment because we'd hoped to even find a residual trace of the cairn. It's quite likely that there is some, we may have found some bits of what could be the cairn, but we weren't able to prove it because of the position of some services and also the roadside beside it, which we weren't able to undermine. But we didn't find any substantial trace of the cairn. What we did find was an 18th century roadway, which was very interesting. And we also found outside the cairn and cut into that some 19th century potato rigs, so which are pretty ubiquitous across the Irish landscape, of course. This is the 18th century roadway. Quite interestingly, it seems to stop at the front of the cairn. And it also has, I think you probably see it in the next photograph, maybe, it also had two little sort of gullies cut into it, which seem to be at the the right separation for a cart. So someone was regularly bringing a cart along this metal surface. And given that we know that there are accounts of, from the Ordnance Survey memoirs, of the stones from the cairn of this tomb having been taken and used to make roadways in the area, we wonder, in the process of making the roadways, have they put a little bit of a road up to the side of the tomb to help them when they were extracting some of the material to be taken away to make some of the other tombs in the area. But if they did that, they did it after they'd removed part of the cairn, because the cairn would have extended out beyond the area of the roadway. You can just see here the roadway was quite well constructed, actually. It's got two layers, as the best roads do, of course. The underlying layer was rougher stone than the fine stone metalling which was put on top. The underlying layer had pottery in it, which was clearly 18th century. There was nothing older than 18th century found in the material that made up the road. So it seems likely that the road therefore must date to probably the end of the 18th century, or maybe the very early 19th century. And that's just a bird's eye plan of the type that archaeologists make of their excavations, showing the metal surface of the roadway, showing the ruts running into the roadway, showing the potato rigs cutting into the metal surface, and then the position of the stone tombs itself, and some of the bedrock in the area as well. With regards to the tomb interior, we found several different deposits. We have already removed the topsoil at this stage, the sod and the topsoil. And then there were two deposits which were of archaeological nature, which were under the topsoil, an upper tomb deposit, if you like, and a lower tomb deposit. And then cut down into the subsoil itself, the underlying clay subsoil, which overlay the bedrock, there were a number of pits cut into the natural subsoil. So we had, this was a pit which was cut into the natural subsoil. This is a large pit which was cut into the natural subsoil. And actually, and you can probably see it here from the outer hashers, this is slightly misleading, this edge. It very slightly runs under this large portal stone. I'll show you that, a photograph of that in a minute. We didn't actually realise just how much it was undermining this large portal stone until we looked at it one day and went, oops, we better get some props put in here. And we did straight away, thankfully, with the help of the Dunluce HED Dunluce men who came down and put in the props for us. But it slightly undermines this portal stone. And these are just really depressions caused by the placing of the other portal stone and a little flanker stone which was beyond it. This is a photograph, and you can see there actually, yes, when we started to realise that this pit was slightly running under the portal stone, and it wouldn't take very much for the portal stone to collapse inwards. This photograph also shows illustrates quite nicely the sequence of tomb construction here. There were things in place here before the tomb was constructed. This pit predates the construction of the tomb, and this pit was filled up with earth, which was then capped with this stone layer. You can see some of the stones in situ, if you like, pressed down by the weight of this portal stone a little bit into the pit, and some of the other stones here, which were capping the pit and making a little platform around that large pit. This predates the construction of the tomb. So we have a pit, and then we have a stone layer, and then we have the construction of the tomb on that horizon. On the left-hand side here, actually, I should not bless myself, I'm just doing north, south, east, and west. On the west side of the tomb, in addition to this stone sort of stone flooring layer, if you like, which some of the side stones of the tomb were set upon, there were little stone wedges which had been in place, presumably to even up the level of the ground and make sure that the side chamber stones weren't listing inwards. Another photograph, unfortunately, a little bit in shadow, showing this pit and showing this large flanker stone sort of sitting over the edge of it. Also, one of the problems we had during the excavation, and it hasn't really too much affected our results, but it has caused a certain amount of what soil scientists call bioturbation, which is a fancy name for soil layers getting mixed up because of root action. We had quite a lot of root action into the tomb, and this is roots really from the nearby ash trees, and that's just a very good example of one of them, which was coming through coming through the soil layers in the middle of the tomb. And here's a nice aerial view where you can see you can see the chamber. These are the side stones, the back stones. That's the standing portal stone, and that's the flanker stone. We had already at that stage removed the broken portal stone to be taken back to the HED Maghera depot for repair. And this is just a slightly bigger version of one of the cross sections that we drew through the centre of the tomb, showing that, just to demonstrate that as well as doing bird's eye, if you like, plans, archaeologists also make cross-section drawings through the various different archaeological strata to illustrate what they found. So it's an archive, if you like, made up of drawn record in two different dimensions, top down and, if you like, vertically or vertically through the site. It's a photographic record. Increasingly nowadays a 3D photographic record, but we hadn't really that technology quite then. And in addition, we have soil samples, and we also have the artifactual record, the things that we find inside the tomb, which we also record by grid square and also by the stratum, the soil layer, which they came out of. So just to refresh the sequence of tomb construction, the first thing that seems to be happening is the construction of the big pre-stone pit. Then there seemed to be the pit, it was filled up, and then there was a deposit of stones laid on top of that pit. There is evidence for some sort of brief fire whenever that pit had been filled up, but before some of the stones had been put in place, there was fire reddening. Unfortunately, very little charcoal. In fact, we couldn't really find any charcoal from our soil samples of the fire reddened material, which suggests that whatever was being burnt there was undergoing very complete combustion. So it might just have been, just almost kindling, if you like, or very dry, very dry, thin pieces of wood and leaves and grass and bark and stuff like that, which completely combusted, leaving no trace for us to find in our soil samples. And then after this sort of evidence you could suggest it's some sort of fire ritual. It's not an impossibility. And fires have been found underneath many different types of Neolithic ritual sites before, but unfortunately this is the only example under a portal tomb. And then the orthostats, that's the standing stones, the archaeological term for the standing stones which make up the tomb, seem to have been put in place after that. Our presumption is that at that stage, once the orthostats are in place, the cairn is put in place, and then the cairn is braced internally with timbers, much in the manner that the depot men did for us at Tirnony for health and safety reasons. And then once those timbers are in place and the cairn is constructed, the structure is rigid enough to use as a ramp to pull the big heavy cairn stone up into place. Now there is an alternative theory about how portal tombs were constructed, which has recently been proposed in a book, Monuments in the Making, by Vicky Cummings and Colin Richards. And it's predicated on there being no portal tombs with cairns, which doesn't seem to be the case in the excavated record. There are portal tombs found with cairns. And it's also predicated on the basis that the pits, which are commonly found, like the one that we found underneath the tomb, are actually the quarry pits for the portal stone itself. And they suggest that the portal stones are quarried from virgin rock, if you like, and then are raised up by levers and props up until until they're at a certain height, and then the orthostats are placed in. The problem is our pit's nowhere near large enough for our capstone, and that's something which has been found in quite a few excavations of portal tombs. Yes, there are some examples in South Wales, which Cummings and Richards have found, where the pit is large enough for the the capstone to have been quarried in situ. But I don't think that the evidence really yet can be said to completely support their contention. And I would suggest that certainly at Tirnony, given that we have testimony that there was a tomb there a cairn there a few decades before the Ordnance Survey memoirs, and the fact that we might have found traces of the cairn, admittedly unproven because we couldn't dig onto them because of the roadway and pipes and stuff like that that were running to the side of us, and the fact that our pit's too small to have been a quarry pit. I think that at Tirnony we can say the more traditional view of portal tomb construction is probably the more likely. Oh, I try to keep trying to get rid of these animated bits, but they still crop up. So we got quite a lot. We got lots of artifacts from the interior of the tomb, despite the fact that it was a small excavation. I have to say, just in passing, we didn't excavate the very, very, very back of the tomb, and that's because, in consultation with the HED works team who were going to carry out the renovation, it seemed that it was unlikely that that place was going to get particularly disturbed. And I really wanted to dig all of it, I must admit. But Dr. Brian Williams, wise words really, sage words, he said, you know, if you don't need to dig it, don't dig it. And he suggested that we leave it, so we left it. So there is still a little bit of a time capsule, if you like, there for someone to go back and look at in the future. But despite the fact we didn't dig absolutely everything, we did most of the interior, we left a little bit at the end, just that little bit there at the back. But we did find lots and lots of artifacts. And the artifacts really were two main types. We found pottery artifacts, and I mentioned, of course, the importance of pottery for both as a ubiquitous find on early Neolithic excavations in Ireland and Britain and Western Europe, but also because it's one of these sort of transformative technologies which seems to have had ritual significance for Neolithic people as well. And I'll talk about that briefly in a second. And we also found several really nice flint artifacts. The one I showed you earlier, which I'll be showing you again in a second, and a couple of other this lovely small flint knife, and this absolutely beautiful scraper, which actually would have functioned as a sort of a discoidal knife just as easily because it had a very, very, very sharp edge. So it's on the cusp of being a scraper and a knife. That's our some people call it a slug knife or a plano-convex knife by archaeologists. Absolutely beautiful artifact, the one I showed you the photograph of earlier. And these are the other two. Another, I suppose you would really say this is pretty much a plano-convex knife as well, just as not as nice a one. And this lovely discoidal flint. The pottery, we found about evidence for fragments of about 14 or 15 different pottery vessels. Of those, I think 12 were what's called Western Neolithic pottery, or something's called the Carinated pottery tradition, and dating, roughly from about 30, well, any time really after 4000 BC, the earliest Neolithic communities. And what was really interesting about the pottery was that we didn't not just find any complete bowls, intact bowls, obviously. We didn't find any complete bowls. So we didn't find any bowls which had been taken in and broken in situ over the years, but we could piece back together. We didn't even find more than about an eighth of an actual bowl of any type of Neolithic vessel. So we'd like small fragments of roughly 12 different Neolithic vessels. We had a couple other vessels as well, which are slightly later, and there's a little bit of later activity, which I'll briefly talk about before the end. But we had 12 highly fragmented vessels, of which only a little bit of each vessel had been brought in. And this has been noticed before. This isn't something new about Tirnony. This has been noticed before in other Neolithic, certainly early Neolithic tombs, not so much the passage tombs, but in the portal tombs and to a certain extent the court tombs. People are bringing vessels to the tombs which are already broken. And there does seem to be ethnographically a cross-cultural comparison between people and vessels. I mean, you even hear the phrase, oh, he's a bit of an old crock, of someone that's and this is, I mean, it's everywhere really. It's in the Bible. It's even the way we talk about vessels. Like the vessel's neck, the vessel's belly. There is a sort of a two-way anthropomorphization of vessels, and similarly a sort of an imposition of us onto vessels and vessels onto us. And so the idea of the smashed vessel being in some respect maybe comparable with the damaged or dead human is maybe something which was in the minds of these users of the tomb. We also found this, and this is not Neolithic. This is an early medieval blue glass bead, and this is, I say, there are a number of different episodes of later use of the tomb, later ritual use of the tomb, probably. And the reason why we think this might be later ritual use of the tomb is because in the literature search that we did after the excavation, we found that blue glass beads like this have been found in other portal tombs and other court tombs as well. And they're always blue, and they're always like this, and there's always one of them. And there's at least 3 or 4 different excavations which have produced a single blue glass bead like this of early medieval date, so around about 700 AD or something like that, in an early medieval tomb, and in an early Neolithic tomb. And one of the I was talking to someone who was the name I've noted down in my notes, but my notes aren't coming up, so I can't remember the name check. But a guy said to me, "Have you ever read Edward Lloyd about his travels in the Western Isles of Scotland at the end of the 17th century?" Edward Lloyd was a Welsh antiquarian, one of the founders of the Royal Society, and he had noted that in the late Middle Ages in Scotland, I suppose late Middle Ages, very early modern period, in Scotland, that people used to look through blue glass beads as an eye cure. And interestingly, there's supposed to be a holy well in the vicinity of Tirnony, which is considered an eye well for the curing of sore eyes. So the idea that somebody in the 16th or 17th century was storing their eye amulet in Tirnony portal tomb, and for that matter in other portal tombs, is a possible explanation that this is associated with some sort of folk magic, and this wonderful object of the other world, if you like, is being returned after use to another worldly place. So that's one potential interpretation of the fact that these blue glass beads seem to have been found on a number of occasions in these tombs. Of course, you can come up with other explanations, explanatory behaviour as well. This is a little bit dark actually, but what I'm really trying to illustrate here is the position of our 3 flint knives. The flint knives are all found at the edge of the tomb, and they're all found closest to the side stones. So there's one here. That's the really nice plano-convex knife found right against that side stone. The less nice, but still fairly nice, plano-convex knife is found against this side stone, and if I've marked it there, DK, but getting rid of that terminology, discoidal knife, but it's probably actually a scraper. The little scraper, the circular scraper, is set against this front side stone, right up against it. And the other thing about, if you look at the density of pottery finds in the tomb, you find that the areas with the 3 knives here, here, and here are actually areas which have very, very little pottery. This is just one tiny fragment of pottery, as opposed to beside the really nice plano-convex knife, as opposed to the next square along, which is 34 pieces. And it almost looks like, to some extent, that the flint is almost, the location of the flints in the tomb is trying to avoid, if you like, the location of the pots or the pot fragments. And archaeologists find this sometimes, or things like this sometimes, and it's a term they use as structured deposition. So there's a logic behind the placement of these different artifacts in the tomb. Can we figure out what that logic is? Well, we can make attempts at figuring out what that logic is, but of course verifiability is necessarily difficult. Although if you find repeated behaviour time after time after time, at least strengthens the idea that there's some sort of internal logic, and you can try and use different intellectual mechanisms. I don't know if any are familiar with structuralism, the work of Claude Lévi-Strauss and people like that. But you can use various different intellectual techniques and mechanisms to try and get your way a little bit into the head of the user and maybe make some suggestions as to what that internal logic might have been. And one additional piece of evidence that we have is, which might get us a little bit into the mindset of the users, a little bit, is this phosphate analysis. And we took, as I mentioned earlier, we took soil samples of the excavated areas, unfortunately not these, or maybe fortunately really, because we have this time capsule left, but not these squares which you didn't excavate, but the rest of the tomb. We took soil samples, as I mentioned, from every single soil layer and also from every single 25 centimetre square. And we got phosphate analysis from the University of Bradford, Archaeological Sciences Laboratory, of the levels of phosphorus and other chemical compounds with it, like calcium, within the various different squares. And what was noticeable is that there's very little phosphorus in the upper tomb deposit. But in the lower tomb deposit, there are some very high levels of phosphorus, extremely high levels of phosphorus. And they concentrate in these sort of 3 squares here, which are pretty much in the center of the tomb and away from the sides of the tomb. And they're also the locations where we're finding the most pottery. And our analyst who looked at this, one of our co-papers, or co-authors in the paper, he believes that this is most likely, because it's in the lower tomb deposits and the spread of the different chemical compounds, that this likely represents the decay of uncremated, if you like, mammal remains. So, and almost certainly human bodies being placed into the tomb completely fleshed and being allowed to essentially to rot and decay in situ. So they have neither been burnt or they haven't been defleshed elsewhere. They've been brought into the tomb in a fully fleshed condition and placed as much as possible in the central area of the tomb and away from the sides. And that's the same places where the pot is being bought. So the pot seems to, the fragments of pottery seem to be being deposited in the same places that the bodies are likely to be being placed. It would be good if we had more comparators to compare this with. Unfortunately, the Pool na Brone, which is probably the most intensively studied portal tomb, didn't have the type of soil deposits in which you could carry out phosphate analysis. But in some respects, they were better off because they didn't have acid soils which dissolved the bones, and they had the actual human remains surviving to examine. But also there, they were on a limestone karst platform where the artifacts had probably been moved around a little more, so they didn't have evidence so much for artifact patterning. But they also had the same practice or pattern of only small amounts of each vessel being brought to the tomb. Radiocarbon dating. We got a series of radiocarbon dates, and it was quite surprising actually, the spread of radiocarbon dates that we got. We got 3 radiocarbon dates which returned Neolithic dates. They were from short-lived twig samples and hazelnut shells. It's quite important when you're carrying out a radiocarbon date to use the appropriate type of sample. If I was to get a radiocarbon date from a piece of ancient oak, well, that oak could have been growing for maybe 300 or possibly even 400 years before it was cut down and the wood used. So potentially there could be an inaccuracy added to the radiocarbon date by the age of the wood. So what we try and do is we try and get radiocarbon dates from either something which has clearly only got 1 year's growth, like a twig or a nutshell or something like that, or cereal grains, or alternatively, if we are dating large pieces of wood, there are specialists who can try and identify whether you're looking at the heartwood, which maybe has a big age offset, and at least you can account for that or statistically allow for that, or alternatively try and get the sapwood or the woods close to the sapwood actually, which are maybe only a few years old and which won't add very much offset to the date. So we had 3 short-lived samples which really range from about 3900 BC to about 3600 BC. And then we had a gap. And then actually a little surprise to us, although we did find 2 pieces of Bronze Age pottery, which I didn't mention going past, but we found some early Bronze Age activity and then some Middle Bronze Age activity. This was all hazelnut shells. And so people seem to have at probably, well, 1, maybe 2, possibly 3 occasions in the Bronze Age brought hazelnut shells, charred hazelnut shells, possibly as some sort of an autumnal offering or something like that, placed them into the tomb. And that's a separate period of activity, which apart from the 2 pieces of Bronze Age pottery which we found in the upper tomb layers, we'd have very little idea about. Well, one was a piece of grooved ware, which is actually very late Neolithic pottery, and one was probably part of what's called a miniature vessel. It used to be called a pygmy vessel, but we don't call it that anymore. But it gives you the idea that they're very small, which is more of Middle Bronze Age date. So apart from that, we had no idea really there was any Bronze Age activity at this tomb, and then we had some. Two Iron Age dates, one on a piece of twig and one on another charred hazelnut shell, and then a few charred cereal dates from the High Middle Ages from about 1200 AD, 4 dates which are almost exactly the same and probably relate to the same event. We had imagined that our entire radiocarbon sequence would likely be in the early and middle Neolithic, but actually no, we had many indications of later activity. So what does it all mean? I mentioned earlier that that portal tombs and court tombs occur mostly in the northern half of Ireland. And that's true. You can see there this distribution map of portal tombs and court tombs. The portal tombs are the blue triangles, and the court tombs are the sort of the black, sort of like a gull shape, if you like. There is a little group of portal tombs also down in southeast Leinster as well, a smattering of them, but the bulk are in the northern half of Ireland, and court tombs are also concentrated in the northern half of Ireland, with just a few smattering across the rest of the island, the main areas. In quite a lot of areas, you have roughly a ratio of about 3 court tombs to every 1 portal tomb. And the portal tombs, as I mentioned earlier, are slightly earlier. So we've got a few portal tombs in the sort of mid-Derry stroke Londonderry, East Tyrone kind of area. But we have we probably over that area have a few more court tombs than we have portal tombs. So the question really is, what sort of relationship do they have with each other? Because apart from their form being different and their date being different, the ritual behaviour that we see inside them, the bringing in of human remains, the artefact types, the types of flint tools and the types of pottery and the highly fragmented nature of the pottery seems to be the same for both tomb types. So the ritual behaviour is similar, even though there's a slight chronological separation, and there seem to be a few more anyway. A ratio of roughly 1 to 3 across the whole of the northern half of Ireland of portal tombs to court tombs. I think I really probably talked about this, but one of the few portal tombs, I've talked a little bit, I'll talk a little bit more now, to have been excavated really fully apart from Tirnony. There have been a number of antiquarian and small scale scientific excavations of portal tombs, but the only other one to have had a major excavation carried out on it really is Pool na Brone in the Burren. You'll know it, it's very famous. People of a certain age will remember, I think, a pheasant rising up behind it while sort of Celtic twilight music was played and then a glass of Bushmills appears. You might remember that ad if you're over the age of about 55. So it's been used quite a lot, sort of in tourist advertisements and in sort of like advertising for all sorts of products that want to evoke Irishness, because it's a particularly well situated and impressive tomb. Unlike Tirnony, it had a lot of actual surviving human remains. As I mentioned earlier, acid soils had largely destroyed our human remains at Tirnony. All we were really left with was what we could detect in the phosphate analysis. But here they had the surviving human remains. And as part of this sort of thing again, it was part of It was part of a large project which was carried out just over the last few years by Laura Cassidy and others. Laura Cassidy's the geneticist, of course, becoming quite famous for her DNA studies of ancient DNA. She's from the Smurfit Institute in Trinity College, Dublin. Her and Dan Bradley, of course, who's Maghera, actually very close to Tirnony. They have pioneered this work and sort of the analysis of ancient DNA. And Laura and her colleagues carried out a very wide-scale DNA analysis of really all of the Irish tombs which had human remains which were capable of DNA analysis. In other words, unburnt, undecayed human remains. And one of those tombs that they looked at was at Pool-na-Brone. And they looked at Pool-na-Brone and they were able to compare it with the court tomb, Park-na-Binia, which is just a few miles away. That's Pool-na-Brone, that's Park-na-Binia. They're about 6 miles away. And they found out some really interesting things. They found out, firstly, that the people who lived at Pool-na-Brone and the people who lived at Park-na-Binia were relatives. They weren't close relatives. They were related at about the sort of 4th, 5th, 6th cousin level. In other words, it was probably consistent what you would expect of two random groups taken from a couple of communities separated by 6 or 7 or 8 miles away. You know, if you were to do the same thing in two villages, presumably today, you would find that unless you were actually picking families that you knew were related, that they would all kind of be related at the 4th, 5th cousin level. And so it showed that Pool-na-Brone and Park-na-Binia were part of the same community. It was the same people, probably the same wider, for one of a bird, hate terms like ethnic group, because then you have to define them and it all gets awkward. But you know what I mean. Part of the same group, wider group, were inhabiting these two tombs. This contrasted, by the way, of course, with the really interesting information from passage tombs, which I'll just mention very briefly, where their work, and it got into the media because they found that passage tomb builders across the whole of the island were quite closely related. And they suggested that this showed an elite group using passage tombs, where it seems that the portal tombs and the court tombs were just used by locals, but the passage tomb users were an all-island elite. And of course, there was the famous incidents of what seems like close consanguinity, shall we say, possibly even incest at Newgrange, which they interpreted in the manner of very close kin relatives in pharaonic Egypt, and similarly being a sort of a priest-king caste at the height of over a Neolithic community. They drew parallels with Egypt, but that wasn't happening with the earlier court tombs and portal tombs. The other really interesting thing they did, as well as look at DNA, they also looked at the isotopes, and particularly the nitrogen-15 isotope in the bones. And they found that in almost all, in fact in all of the tombs bar one, that the people had a mixed diet with, as you would expect for a Neolithic community, evidence of vegetables and evidence for meat eating. But in Pool-na-Brone alone, which was the single portal tomb that they looked at, the evidence from the nitrogen isotopes in their bones suggested that they probably had an almost entirely vegetarian diet. And that's the only tomb in Ireland which has produced any evidence of a vegetarian diet. But it's the only portal tomb where this sort of analysis has been carried out. All the other court tombs and passage tombs had evidence of a mixed diet with significant amount of meat and vegetables, a mixture of significant amount of meat and vegetables, but not Pool-na-Brone. And of course, we don't know if Pool-na-Brone is representative of other portal tombs. But if we play the mind game and start to think about Pool-na-Brone and start to think about other portal tombs, if there was a similarity, if they did have people who were set apart, if you like, from the rest by their diet, then it would maybe change the way that we start to see portal tombs and maybe start to give us an inkling into why we get roughly one portal tomb for every 3 court tombs. And there is this sort of body of thought in anthropology and in archaeology about things called house societies. And a house society was originally a concept of Claude Lévi-Strauss, the great structural anthropologist. And he suggested that there was a type of society in which, the society could be quite diverse, and it could maybe even, the clan, if you like, for want of a better word, could maybe even live in a number of different areas and regions. But what tied them together, if you like, was this symbolic house. And he initially called them house because of work in sort of Indonesia and places like that, where there was a big sort of communal longhouse, which was the headquarters, if you like, of the clan, and was more important than any individual, more important than the chief. And then different offshoots of the clan could be located in different areas. And Claude Lévi-Strauss and other anthropologists said that really it doesn't just have to be a house. Other things can symbolize it. And some people have suggested that in certain occasions, tombs or certain types of tombs can represent the house. But of course, if one tomb's representing the house, and as the clan grows and as it expands, well, then you need additional tombs, and you want to differentiate those additional tombs, presumably in their form, from the original house. So the idea that the tomb, the portal tomb, could form the symbolic, if you like, centre of a particular population group, which might be quite diverse and spread around quite a wide geographic area. But the individual lineages and sublineages of that clan, if you like, or of that tribe or of that group, are then buried in court tombs, is one possible way of explaining the distribution of portal tombs and court tombs in the landscape. That they actually are the same people, they're representing the same groups, but that they have a slightly different function, with one being a symbolic centre and the other being the practical day-to-day burial place. And then if, in addition, we were to find on excavating further portal tombs, and this hasn't happened yet, unfortunately, where there are human remains that can have DNA analysis carried out and isotope analysis carried out, if we find that similarly that they are separated by a different diet, and say they are vegetarians, then we can see the potential for some sort of selected groups of people representing different lineages of the tribe and raised in a specific way, possibly for who knows what end, being brought to the tomb to be representatives of the wider clan in the central tomb. One way of thinking about these, but a way which needs a little bit more evidence to suggest if it's really got legs as an interpretation. So to conclude, Tirnony, built, well, probably around about 3900 BC. There seem to have been several stages. First of all, of course, there was the construction of the pit underlying it, or maybe pits, which seems to be something that's been found in other tomb excavations, not Pool na Brone, incidentally, because, of course, it's built in limestone karst, very hard to do. Although there were cracks in the limestone karst there into which artefacts have been placed, so that may have, maybe functionally, the cracks in the limestone provided the same role. So a pit's constructed, and then a floor level laid down, filled up on the floor level laid down, and then the tomb constructed. There may, have been pauses during that. In fact, we did find one layer, thin soil layer, separating what seems to be 2 phases of construction of the placement of the stones, which was interesting. A stone layer can accumulate in the right conditions in 6 months. It doesn't necessarily mean that it was left for 50 years before the rest of the tomb was built. It could be a very short interval. It could be a long interval. We couldn't really, our radiocarbon chronology was not fine enough to assess that. But certainly it may have been built in several stages. There may even have been a little fire ritual between some of the stages of construction. We found within the tomb itself, we found evidence for human remains, and we found evidence also for artefacts. There seems to be some patterning to the distribution of these artefacts. It looks like the pots, which are very fragmented, are being placed with the human remains. It seems like the flint objects are being placed away from the human remains and away from the pot at the edges of the building. Is there some sort of similar concept of materiality between the hard eternal flint, which never decays, and the hard eternal stone, as opposed to the pots that are easily fragmented, and the people whose lives are limited. Maybe that's certainly one way that you could look at it if you were applying a sort of structural sort of analysis of it. And again, looking collectively at Pull-na-Brone and Tirnony, we can reinforce the idea which Pull-na-Brone had suggested, that portal tombs are somewhat earlier than court tombs, but they continue in use in parallel with them. So, I mean, our latest Neolithic date from Pull-na-Brone was between 35 and 3600 BC, the third Neolithic date, and that's completely within the period of use of court tombs. Court tombs probably started in use about 3700 and continued to about 3500 or thereabouts. So they stay in use in parallel with them. And we know from the DNA analysis that portal tombs and court tombs are probably serving the same local groups. And I said, I don't want to get hung up in terminology and easy to do of different types of anthropological divisions, but the same kind of local groups. And it's just possible that the smaller number of portal tombs relative to court tombs and the possible dietary distinctions that Pull-na-Brone suggests might hint at them having had some sort of additional purpose as well as being tombs, the portal tombs, that they may have been in some respect marked out from from the court tombs. And as a throwaway hypothesis that's not really backed up by any much more than just the few bits of data that we have, it is possible that they might have served as some sort of tribal, not necessarily tribal centre, that's not the right word, because they're not a centre in the modern sense that people would necessarily have like congregated around, but a symbolic tribal centre for the groups that were using them and maybe several other court tombs. So that's kind of brought me to the end, and it's only a few minutes past 2. Have we time for a couple of questions?